Hey everybody, Warhamster Brady here, welcoming you to another episode of the Re-Federalist Report. Joining me today is my good friend, constitutional mentor, Mr. Constitution himself, Douglas V. Gibbs.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. And what do you want to talk about today?
It's been a while since we've had a video, so let's talk about something important.
Yeah, what's everybody talking about this week? Oh, that's right, tariffs. So, as the nature of this show, we're going to talk about the history and the constitutionality of tariffs in U.S. history. Give you a little bit different perspective. And nobody is better to help me present that than Mr. Gibbs. So, let's start with what is a tariff? Probably the simplest explanation, it is an import tax on foreign goods coming into the country. That's about as clear as it gets, but there's more than one kind of tariff. You've got a general tariff, which is basically just a flat fee on all goods coming in, and it is designed to raise revenue for the government. And then you've got the protective tariffs. And that should raise alarm flags anytime you get that, because that's where special businesses get carve-outs to protect themselves from foreign competition and sometimes domestic competition as well. You can also get a regional protective tariffs, and we'll get into all that. But there are two different types of tariffs. The other concept we're going to talk about a little bit today is what's called free trade. And I say that with air quotes around free trade because it really has never been free trade. It almost always comes with carve-outs and attachments to it. The pure libertarian view of absolutely no trade barriers is something the world has really never seen. We got some good points to it in theory, but that's actually not what we've ever gotten to is free trade. So, with no further ado, well, the tariffs had a big deal with why we even have a country in the first place. So, Doug, why don't you touch on the history of the British tariffs and why that kind of was one of the main reasons that spurred the Bloody Revolution?
Well, and when it comes to tariffs and our relationship with the British, we've got to remember that the colonies were seen as just a revenue source. We were another place to produce goods, another place to tax, another place to enable the markets around the world to want to purchase British products being American products, but they weren't American, they were British because we were a British a holding. And so the tariffs were in place also to make sure that they were able to feed this idea called mercantilism. Mercantilism was basically a British way of doing business to make sure that British merchants were protected against American merchants and other merchants around the world. And so that's where the tariffs came in. They made sure that. Go ahead.
Yeah, let me touch on mercantilism real quick, because that's the point I've been hammering home for years here.
Yeah.
Mercantilism is a form of economic policy that basically assumes there's a finite number of goods in the world, and every nation's job is to gather all those resources, mostly gold and silver, into your own nation. They would favor their own protected companies, corporations like the British East India Company being the best example of it, from foreign competition. This is crony capitalism. It's also fascism. The only difference between the mercantilist system and what we have today is this globalist system. It's not about keeping all your coffers, all the gold in one place. It's about expanding everywhere with your tentacles and tendrils everywhere. But it's it's crony capitalism and protectionism.
And that's what the tariffs against the colonies really were, where it was a part of their mercantilist policies, a way to control trade, and once again to protect British merchants. Because again, remember, once again, I said Britain really viewed the colonies nothing more than a revenue source and basically a source of raw materials. There were a lot of things that were coming out of America that Britain couldn't produce at all, or in the amount that America was producing. And so they wanted to make sure that all trade benefited Britain and the British merchants. So they designed the tariffs, the taxes, and the laws regarding trade, and even laws regarding manufacturing. There were a lot of industrial manufacturing methods where the inventions were not shared with the colonies, so that they wouldn't start producing that product in the colonies to protect, once again, British merchants. So it was all about control. Then you had, let's see, let me think about it now. You had the Molasses Act, 1733, which is a high tariff on molasses imported from non-British Caribbean islands, and it was basically to keep the colonies also from importing from non-British producers. Yeah, the Townshend Acts, which was regarding glass, paint, paper, tea, lead, and once again, this is to keep the Americans from purchasing out of the British Empire goods, non-British goods, and then you eventually had these other taxations, these taxes, tariffs that would make it. Well, the Tea Act's a great example. You could before the Tea Act, you could purchase tea from other countries, but it had to go through the British first, so that the tariff was imposed. Then you could receive it. Then eventually there was so much smuggling. You know what? Okay, fine. Now you can only purchase British tea, period. And that's a lot of what was going on. Now, the tariffs and taxes were seen as tyranny, as an abuse of power. And this led to protests and boycotts and so on and so forth. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, an example with the Molasses Act is great. So if you're in Boston and even if you've got your own shipping company, you would have to buy the molasses in the Caribbean, take it to England, and then buy it back, but then buy it from England. It made it so it was incredibly expensive. And what you're describing is there's a reason the golden age of piracy, most of the pirates came from the eastern seaboard of the United States. Quite a few of them did. And that was basically to get around the tariffs and the taxes. So the Stamp Act, a lot of people say that was the match that lit the flame, but as Doug just explained, this fire has been kindling for a long time. So we win the Revolutionary War, and again, it was one of the major causes was to get past these tariffs. And it wasn't just the English doing this; the French would have been doing it on their colonies. The Spaniards would have been doing the same. This was the way Europe had decided they wanted to conduct business, and I think you'll find that even the Chinese Empire had some kind of protective tariffs throughout the ages as well, although they weren't much of a merchant, a maritime empire. So we get to we win a Revolutionary War, and the founding fathers are deciding we're going to start this great experiment in self-determination. So we've got to form our own government. What are their attitudes towards tariffs?
Well, they saw it as a way to raise revenue for the federal government, a way to protect American manufacturing and industries from foreign competition. Alexander Hamilton, like him or not, was actually a strong advocate for tariffs and believed that it would foster domestic manufacturing, which he was right. And the Tariff Act of 1789 was used. One of the first laws passed. I mean, they didn't mess around. Right out the gate, there was a Tariff Act.
Yeah, it was actually the second law ever passed, and it was proposed by none other than James Madison.
Exactly. And so, and it's funny because the tariffs not only we're told that it was a primary source of federal income, and that's not necessarily true. It ranged anywhere from 15% to 35% of the federal revenue. Most of the revenue actually came from the states, but even the states, the taxes they paid and how they made their money, a lot of it was from tariffs. So the tariffs actually indirectly funded the government there. So you could say it was a primary source directly and indirectly, but and some models will say that there were times where tariffs directly and indirectly accounted for up to like 95% of the government revenue at certain times during our history.
Yeah, right up before the Civil War, it was passed to over 90% was coming from tariffs. That's what the number was. Now, it's interesting you talk about Hamilton. Hamilton was proposing protective tariffs where certain industries would be protected. And this is important because you had manufacturing in the north and you had raw goods in the south. And a tariff on imports is actually a tax on exports. So the South could not ship their goods to Europe as profitably because of the North's protective tariffs. The general tariff that Madison proposed was just a flat tariff on everyone, like a 10%. And that's actually, this is an argument to be made, that is a good tariff. You do want to try to keep production at home where possible, while not shutting down your...
Well, there's been a term developed for protection, tariffs used for protection of business. Protectionism, they turn into an ism. And when I say they, anybody who basically stands against the Constitution, because as time passed, it became more of a international and global economy. And one thing that many of the central planners throughout history have noticed and realized is that tariffs are good for domestic protection, but it's not good for global economies. And then we have the idea of extremism. It's, either you're using protectionism and it's overly domestic, or you have none and it's overly globalist. And I've always been a firm believer that tariffs, like anything, are a good tool, but it's a tool that should be used sparingly or carefully. And there are times when you want to jack them up. There's times when you want to back off. And of course, the goal would be that there are no tariffs, except for when absolutely necessary. But
and that's really at the heart of what Trump appears to be doing.
Right.
It's calling them.
And it looks like he's succeeding with Europe. Europe is seeking a 0-for-0 tariff.
Well, we'll get into that at the end, but they don't really have a choice.
No.
Let's jump into the history of tariffs in American history. So, as Doug mentioned,
so we got the Tariff Act of 1789. That's right out the gate.
Primarily for revenue, some protection for quote-unquote infant industries. That's the Northeast manufacturers. Everyone needs to remember that England had about a 50-year head start on industrializing over the rest of the world. That was primarily due to their early adoption of the modern banking system and also what was called the joint stock company, the ability to pool capital. England had a huge head start on the rest of the world, and that's why they became the empire where the sun never sets. It was for economic reasons. We get up here to the Tariff of 1816. This is the first protective tariff Clay and Calhoun supported as part of the American system. It's one of the things about Calhoun that I like the least, that he was part of that. The Southern cotton growers opposed, and this is under the Madison administration. Prior to that, we had a policy of tariffs against British imported goods, and that kind of led to the War of 1812. War of 1812 absolutely impoverished the northeastern states, and some of them even thought about seceding. War of 1812 was over, and we get the Tariff of 1816, which they made an official act. We move on to the Tariff of 1824, which is further heightening of rates, growing opposition from the South. This is under the Monroe administration. Now, the Federalists are all long gone by now, but the Whigs have come into power, and they are also nationalists, which means they are, very much in favor of these protective tariffs. And that brings us to the famous Tariff of Abominations. It says higher protective measures for New England mills. Southerners are outraged, including Calhoun. This is under the John Quincy Adams administration. Let's talk about the Tariff of Abominations again, because it's a very important part of U.S. history.
Well, some of those percentages got as high as 45% on raw materials. And, it was because you got to realize that the northern industries were nothing without the raw materials from the South. And they had to make sure that the Southern economy, that the South was not having any relations with foreign traders. And so they put these in place basically to protect the industries in the North from foreign competition. And also it wound up impacting the Southern economy, who relied on imported goods and trade with Britain, not only for their well-being, but also for a lot of the materials, machinery, things like that helped them produce the raw materials in the first place. The state the state that was first to be outraged is the state that seems to be the first to be outraged every time something happened in the South was South Carolina. And they actually nullified that tariff. And it led to what's called the nullification crisis. And this is where I get frustrated, because I believe nullification is a wonderful tool for states. And James Madison and Jefferson and the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions showed voiced their approval of nullification as a power of the states. But Madison was upset at South Carolina for nullifying, because he believed it was that the tariff was a completely constitutional law and that they were nullifying a constitutional law. And so he basically argued against their nullification. Those who historians out there who argue against nullification as being a good tool will use that then and say, see, Madison was against nullification. No, he was against nullification being used in the wrong manner. So South Carolina tried to reject the tariff. They argued it was unconstitutional. It was constitutional. Federal government can hit tariffs, but eventually that particular tariff, the rates were eventually reduced because of the political battle and all that. So while South Carolina, their nullification was slapped down, their attempt to nullify actually had the effect they wanted, which was to reduce the rate. So.
Yeah, that's punitive tariffs that high, which it was never going to work for them. But a quick note on nullification. Every state has the right to, the federal government has the right to pass some laws, the ones that are enumerated in the Constitution, those authorities. The state doesn't think it's constitutional. They can't overturn the law, but they can say, okay, fine, pass your law. We're not going to use any of our state employees to help you enforce the law. And the federal government is not big enough to enforce a law in now 50 states. So nullification is still effective, and it is very constitutional.
Well, it depends. And once again, is the law constitutional or not when they nullify? For example, in today's political arena, you're basically seeing a number of states nullifying perfectly constitutional immigration law and immigration actions through their laws that create the sanctuary state dynamic. And those laws are actually, those to nullify immigration are actually unconstitutional. Because all the immigration laws are purely constitutional. Federal government can, for example, deport who needs to be deported because they broke the law to get in the first place, much less criminal aliens. And then what happens there is then Article 6 gets involved. Article 6, the Constitution and laws made pursuant to the Constitution and treaties are the supreme law of the land. The states can't make laws that are contrary. Nullification of a perfectly constitutional law is unconstitutional. Nullification of an unconstitutional law is constitutional. So while states do have the power to nullify, they have the power to nullify responsibly and within the Constitution's authorities.
Very good. And that's an important topic. We talked about nullification quite a bit over the last 8 years.
Hey, it's a big deal. It's an important tool.
Yep. And by the way, nullification is a tool of peace, whereas secession is one not necessarily the case. Nullification is a way to, yes, we want to stay within the union, but we're not going to, you're not going to force us to do something against our will that we think is unconstitutional. That is the peaceful solution to tyrannical government. We get to 1832. This was the compromise Doug mentioned. It was
this is with the attempt to compromise. The one that actually finally appeased South Carolina came a year later.
Yeah, and this is where it sparked the nullification crisis.
Right.
1833, the Clay Compromise comes in. It's a gradual reduction of rates over time to the 1816 levels. Mm-hmm. And of course, the New England states opposed that.
Right.
We get to the Tariff of 1842. It was an upward revision forced by the Depression following the Panic of 1837 under the Tyler administration. Now, we've talked about Tyler as maybe perhaps the most constitutional president that has ever served in the United States, basically because he just did not use the power of the federal government. And they did suffer through a pretty nasty depression.
Well, it occurred, though, because of his predecessors. And tariffs are an interesting animal because they don't help recessionary times. But I don't believe they necessarily cause them unless the rate is just absolutely ridiculous and we depend too heavily on imports.
Yeah, we'll touch that topic in a second here when we get to the Smoot-Hawley. But yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Smoot-Hawley is a good example, and
we'll get there.
Yeah, that's one I definitely want to talk about. But go ahead.
All right, then we've got the Walker tariff. Democrats controlled Congress. The West supported tariff reduction in the hope of selling grain abroad, and there's a move toward tariff for revenue only under the Polk administration. That's interesting. A move towards a tariff for revenue only. That would get rid of the protectionism. Obviously, that didn't last too long. And now we get the Tariff of 1857, which is another downward tariff revision to almost free trade status. Of course, the North opposes. What's also going on in the 1850s is the birth of a new political party known as the Republicans. Republicans have always been international trade proponents, and they've always been pro-tariff. This is the party of tariffs. They're coming into power in 1857, or 1854, I think it was founded. Do I have that right?
1854 is when they were created. 1856 was the first election they had a presidential candidate.
Yeah, actually, the party origins do go to 1844, but nobody would have noticed until about 10 years later. All right, here's the big one.
Well, and let's add something here. And I know this is something that you talked about more in modern times, but understand that when tariffs get talked about, there's always a component that gets left out. And in fact, I wrote an article at douglasvgibbs.com just the other day about this. Is we always focus on American tariffs. Don't forget, there are tariffs also being imposed against United States products. Our exports and importing, if we're going to be in a global market, when we have global consumers of our products, we're trying to get our products also into those markets. And so, everybody's like, well, we shouldn't, or we should charge a tariff. And we have to remember there's that other component. We forget often that other component exists. So we have to take that into consideration also. So there's always more to the story than meets the eye, so to speak. Okay, go ahead.
And we're going to see this happen post-Civil War. I'll jump into that topic again. Remind me of what you just said. So here comes the big one. The election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party come to power. And they come with it the promise of massive tariffs, back up over 40%. There were four presidential parties that had viable candidates in 1860. Lincoln won with about 41% of the vote. The other three were low tariff, and the Republicans were high tariff. And it was pretty well known that if the Republican Party came into power, that some states in the South would be, they felt that they would be forced to secede because the incoming tariffs would not be, they just could not tolerate it. So the Wartime Tariff Act steadily increased protectionism to help fund Union war costs. The South, of course, is not represented in Congress. So the North is basically imposing these tariffs.
And understand, even before that particular, the Morrill tariff, which you're talking about in 1861, prior to that, there were increases in the tariffs that weren't actually official tariffs. And where the South got mad is not only were tariffs being raised, but they were being done in a manner that they believe is unconstitutional because you weren't seeing official legislation that was being done through, dare I say, executive order. Now, the law existed allowing the president to do that, just as today, but the South saw that as a threat, as a movement towards a centralization of power and favoritism towards the North. All right, go ahead.
You mentioned something interesting, executive orders, and we probably should have started the show with this.
And they didn't call them executive orders back then, by the way, but that's beside the point. Go ahead.
The question comes down to who can levy the tariffs. We're seeing all these congressional acts creating tariffs, yet here we sit today, and it's President Trump unilaterally putting a tariff. So who constitutionally has that authority?
Well, so that's interesting because it's a little bit of a double-sorted answer. Tariffs can be created, has to be created, or managed or regulated essentially through law, what the law says. The thing is, there are laws on the books that say that in certain situations, the president by executive order can increase, reduce, or manage tariffs as he desires if it has something to do with national security or an emergency. Now, whether or not the president should constitutionally have that power is not the point. His job as president of the United States is to execute the laws of the United States, constitutional or not. If the law exists, he has the authority based on that law. And so President Trump is completely within his constitutional authorities because there's a law. I can't remember the name of the law off the top of my head. I'll look it up in a minute. But the law that's on the books that allows the president to do this in the name of national security or an emergency. Otherwise, the creation or repeal of a tariff has to be done legislatively.
Yeah, and we saw, I know this is jumping ahead, but because you mentioned the executive orders, now's a good time to talk about this. We saw last week a bill come out of the Senate sponsored by Chuck Grassley and some Democrats, basically saying that within like 72 hours, Congress had to approve any tariff that the president did. Now, people all stressed out about that, but a couple of things about that. First of all, the House isn't even going to bring that up for a vote ever. And second of all, even if they did, Trump's vetoing it the second it hits his desk.
Right.
So that was more of a virtue signal. I don't know what Chuck Grassley is thinking. Maybe he's catering to his free trade constituents. And again, free trade with big air quotes. When I say free trade constituents, you're talking about basically the Chamber of Commerce lobbyists who are supposed to lobby for small business, but actually are about 99% of the money comes from the multinational corporations. Their version of free trade, which we're going to get to later on, is full of all kinds of carve-outs for special industries and cartels. And that's what Grassley's catering to. So if those people want to know what that's all about, it's just pure lobbyist politics.
The act that Donald Trump is acting under is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977.
Thank you. And that was basically put in place during the oil embargo.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Civil War is over. And what's going on in America now? Now, since Monroe, we've had basically an isolationist foreign policy, the Monroe Doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, as Doug and I have been discussing, we've got industries that want to export. So it's kind of hard to be isolationist and get a little bit of internationalist, for your economic purposes. These two forces, contrasting forces, are going to play itself out in the latter half of the 1800s. And as America starts to grow, both economically and militarily, we become a player on the world stage. So you get to the Tariff Act.
And when we're a player on the world stage, remember, the people that are involved don't want to rock the boat. They want to make sure that our trading partners are completely happy because they're trying to sell their products, so on and so forth. And so they want to be careful. And then you come in, someone says, no, we got to protect our manufacturing. That's what the next part is about. Go ahead.
Yeah, and we're also going on right now, you've got the rise of the robber barons. And the thing that really facilitated the rise of the robber barons was not only protective tariffs, but what you call internal improvements. This is something Hamilton had proposed, and all of the Lincolnian Republicans were big proponents of. In fact, that they rode into power on the back of these ideas. When we say internal improvements, just think about government graft. The favorite businesses are going to get government money to basically.
Sounds like mercantilism.
It's exactly what it is. There's a pre-modern version of it. Yeah, right now we're really talking about the railroads and the steel industry. Back in the Hamilton's days, it was canals. But so these robber barons made ungodly amounts of wealth, and the government funded most of the railroad. So
Dow will come along with his chemicals, and then you'll start seeing other industries also start to rise at the same time.
Yeah, so these people, the richest people in the world, in America's history, got every incentive to put their politicians into power so they continue to get their goodies. It is corporate welfare, and that's how these people made their money. So that's and the politicians that they're sending to DC are all going to be their lapdogs. They're going to let the gravy train continue.
And I understand it's not just through tax favors, but also subsidies.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, a great example of that, and I've talked about it with you before, is There were two transcontinental railroads. There was the one that the government built, which zigzags all across the United States, because some towns paid bribes to the railroad and some didn't. So they couldn't build in a straight line. And that one took twice as long as expected, and of course was more than double the cost. And then you had the private transcontinental railroad that went from the Great Lakes area all the way to Washington State. That was built by privately funded. It was in a straight line, and it got done on time and under budget. And that's the Northern Railroad, and that's just a great example of why the government is basically incompetent to do anything besides, conduct war and raise taxes. That's all the government's really good at, as we're seeing every single day with more Dozier reports. All right, so we get to the Tariff of 1872. It's a post-war reform tariff, reduced rates on some manufactured goods under grant.
So once again, we're trying to get involved into the global economy, and there's tariffs against us. This is what, but we want their business, so we're keeping ours below theirs. We're being careful. We want the global economy to mature and to insert us more into it. Go ahead.
Yeah, and the Grant administration is one of the more corrupt in American history. They were giving out benefits. They were picking winners and losers, giving out benefits all over the place. Grant should not be looked upon all that favorably historically, although he was a rather successful general, not so much so as a president.
Right. He's one of he's one of two presidents prior to Franklin Delano Roosevelt that tried to run for a third term at one point. But anyway, go ahead.
The Tariff of 1875, we see continued downward revisions on the tariffs. Average rates are reduced by 10%. Mm-hmm. In 1883, they have something called the Mongrel Tariff. It's where the Republicans abandoned reform and compromise and satisfied nobody. We had all kinds of economic turmoil during the decade around this period. Banks failing.
Remember, there's those that are calling for higher tariffs, and they're bringing down these numbers to try to facilitate more global participation in trade.
And what's going on the international scale, the United States is in the process of building up a fleet of battleships, so they can basically exert their will. They need territories and markets. And we see that for the first time, the United States become an imperial power, although I'd make the argument that Lincoln started that because conquering the Free South was the first imperial conquest.
Well, you got to realize, too, though, that the Navy, going all the way back to the very beginning, was about protecting trade routes. Yeah, protecting international trade. And so while it may be seen as imperialistic, it really was to protect those trade routes.
Yeah, what I'm suggesting is right now we're about to see a shift where it's not just protecting trade routes, it's about establishing foreign bases and territories. Mm-hmm. And then we get the McKinley Tariff. It's in 1890. McKinley was the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, and the highest protective tariff to date, averaged 48%. McKinley would go on to become president.
And he was a danger to global trade, according to those pushing for this, among other things. He was a danger to all kinds of things. I actually like McKinley in many ways. I liked him as a vice president even more, but that's another discussion for another time.
Okay, we get to 1894, the Wilson-Gorman Tariff. It was a reform measure crippled by the Senate amendments. So they tried to do a reform, but the Senate was carving out too many special exemptions to that. It's about this time bills went from being about this thick to about this thick. The DC politician was finally learning how to basically bury stuff inside bills. And then we got the 1897 Dingley Tariff. It's a blatantly protective measure, some rates at 57%. This is the McKinley administration. So he's a huge protectionist, another Republican. The following year is 1898.
Yeah, so hang on a second. That 1897 tariff, understand. Now, some of those rates, some of them reached as high as 57%.
Yeah, which is ridiculous. 1898 is when American expansionism really started. We invaded Hawaii. We'd already, in the 1890s, had negotiated for the annexation of Panama for the Panama Canal. And, basically we're Navy's conducting operations to support American shipping companies in creating banana republics in South and Central America. And then, of course, we got the Spanish-American War of 1898, where the United States ends up with the territories of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and Philippines. And Philippines is supposed to be some kind of trade hub. But
and I don't want to say that that Spanish-American War was necessarily a war of expansion. I don't believe it was. However, we did expand our territories out of it, and we weren't complaining about it.
Yeah, we can't litigate the cause of the Spanish-American War in one show. But so I'll just suggest that American business interests had an awful lot of incentive for that war to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we get to 1909, the Payne-Aldrich Tariff. It's an attempt to lower average level of duties. Little meaningful reform. Progressives were very angered.
Well, it lowered some, it raised others.
Yeah.
And it promised reductions across the board, but there was a bunch of tariffs that wound up getting raised.
The name Aldrich on this bill, on this one, is important. That's Senator Aldrich, who was the Republican chair of the Senate Banking and Finance Committee. He was one of the people it was his train that everyone took to get to Jekyll Island to the following year to create the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, I was getting ready to say he had a Federal Reserve connection big time. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, if the name sounds familiar, his daughter would marry into the Rockefeller family, and he's one of the namesakes for Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller. Mm-hmm. So that's who's pushing the buttons at this point in time, the robber barons themselves. Okay, 1913, one of the greatest years in history, right, Doug?
Yeah, I just love it.
All right. During the progressive era, and the progressives are basically the forefathers today's non-insane Democrats. They wanted the government to basically direct and control every aspect of society, and that, of course, requires a lot of government money and a bigger government.
Let's set a stage here real quick, if you don't mind. So, understand that the progressive era began, and you'll have arguments as exact date. So I'll use 1890 to be safe, but really got its start in the 1880s. And the idea of the progressive era was move towards more central government control, to move towards a more socialist style system, and globalism, global trade being a part of that. And so you want to facilitate these things. And so once again, I said this early in the show, higher the tariff, the less friendly it is to globalistic, internationalistic kind of feelings. So in 1913, you've got the biggest progressive push towards these things ever seen, with Federal Reserve being created, 17th Amendment taking the voice of the states, the voice of the states out of the federal legislature, and then of course 16th Amendment, which imposed the federal income tax. And this was all a play for this progressive socialist push and a push towards a more global economy. Globalism is not something new. When we talk about globalism, and I talk about Trump's tariffs are really a fight against the globalistic nature of what's going on. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have international partners and be involved in global trade and all that, but when the whole push is towards globalism, and this is where it really began in full earnest. So it's just, we have to understand that's what this is all about. All right, go ahead. No,
it's a great way to set that up. And the people pushing this, of course, are the robber barons. It's the Eastern establishment, are America's own blue blood nobility. And they've been marrying across the Atlantic into British families. So they get their titles of nobility. And these captains of industry have massive amounts of dollars and unlimited markets. They're digging oil all over the world, and because of that, they have their interests are spread so many different places. They need to have an influence on foreign policy, and that's why you start getting world wars. 1913 was a huge shift. Tariffs have always been a little bit of put a dent in their profit margins. So if the corporations are if these tariffs have to fund the government, it's not as much money for the multinational corporations.
And tariffs have always been demonized by globalists, progressive, so on and so forth. And so while we have gone down the road of tariffs before, in the 20th century and since, using tariffs have become something that was kind of a no-no. It became so demonized. And so that's the reason why you hear in the news now, they say, well, we're in uncharted waters. We've never really gone down. Well, tariffs have never been used in this manner except for way back long ago, and we just don't remember much about it. And once again, there's been this demonization of tariffs. But now understand, I'm not necessarily saying I want all tariffs all the time either. Please don't misunderstand me. Tariffs are just like any other tool. They're a valuable tool to be used at the right time in the right amount. You know, if I need to shoot a squirrel, I don't go out there with a 50 gauge firearm, for example. Sometimes there's too much, but yet, you know, a gun is a tool, and sometimes you need it, sometimes you're not. What are you going to use? How much you're going to use? That's the way tariffs are. So we have to keep that in mind as we go through this exercise. All right, continue, please.
Yeah, very good. And the dramatic shift here is all of a sudden you're going from tariffs funding the government to individual income taxes funding the government. Right. And of course, it was, you know,
and that was done purposely because they're trying to get the eyes off of tariffs. They're trying to get us off of using tariffs because it is good for the global trade, and it is completely disregarded that we're being hit with tariffs. It's all about making sure it's all about our products getting out there and us getting in the cheap product so that it's good for Americans. But it's all about the globalist part of the trade, is what it is.
Yeah, they're trying to, you know, basically say, oh, we're a consumer nation instead of being a production nation.
Right.
But anyways, the dramatic shift that the individual income taxpayer is now supporting a government. I've got a better solution. Why don't you just
well, consumer nation plays into Keynesian economics and all that too. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, well, that's where we got. Yeah, that's where we get Bretton Woods. We're going to get there in a second. Better idea would just be reducing the size of government, which I guess we're starting to do. All right, 1921, we get an emergency tariff. The Republicans returned to power. Progressives got blown out in the 1920 elections because their ideas didn't work. And responded to a mini depression. They raised agricultural rates to protect farmers. It was only a stopgap measure until a new law was written.
And understand, simultaneously, internal improvements have been pretty much stopped when it comes to federal funding and federal involvement. Regulations have been drastically reduced. The tax rate that is being imposed, and at this time, the general public's not being taxed right now. It's the higher incomes. The tax rate has been lowered. Harding and Coolidge are doing everything they can to make sure that a recession doesn't continue to go into place after Wilson. And it works.
Yeah, and the recession is almost inevitable. You almost always get a post-war recession, unless you put massive amounts of stimulus, which I don't think we're not going to have time to get into the Marshall Plan, but I'll give it a brief mention here in a second. So we're in the beginning stage of the Roaring 20s. Everything is going great. Low regulation. People are making money hand over fist. The deregulation got a little out of control, as we'll see. In 22, we get the Fordney-McCumber tariff, which increased rates sharply. President is now empowered to adjust rates. Sounds familiar. The Tariff Commission is created to advise the president. Stock market crashes in 1929 and sets off the Great Depression. Now, whether that was done intentionally or not, I will leave up to you. My thoughts on that are pretty well known.
The Great Depression was done intentionally. It was an asset grab by the bankers, and they used the Federal Reserve to make sure it happened.
Yeah, my thoughts exactly. And we can document that, people. It's not a conspiracy theory; it's a conspiracy fact.
Milton Friedman, though not one of your favorite people for some reasons, accurately has indicated that the Federal Reserve was 100% at fault.
I quote Friedman all the time. He's one of the brightest economists that ever lived.
Yeah.
So in response to that, we passed what's called the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Erroneously, some people say that this caused the Great Depression. No, the Great Depression was already underway.
Sure didn't help, though.
Yeah, it raised duties to an all-time high. 1,000 economists protested, and there was foreign retaliation. Now we've got a global
20,000 imported goods where the rates just went nuts on.
Yep. And the difference between that and today where we have basically a tariff retaliation war or whatever going on, is we started with it from a period of economic strength, not economic weakness.
Mm-hmm.
There's a big difference between the two. And it's also pretty clear that Trump has been willing, anybody who's willing to lower their tariffs and other protectionists against American companies, he will reciprocate and do the same. That's a much different type of trade war than we saw after 1930, the Smoot-Hawley. 1934, we get the whole trade pacts. They received reciprocal treaties to reduce tariffs and stimulate trade during the Depression. Now, it sounds like a great idea. It did not work. The Great Depression was still pretty darn depressing, but it's a move in the right direction. All right, we get to World War II, which is the only reason we get out of the Great Depression was because of the war. Wartime industrial production, everybody had a job. Factories are booming. The war ends.
Now, I maybe I missed it. There was. Did you go over the Trade Agreements Act of 1934? Because right before the Great Depression, there was this allowance for the president to raise and reduce or whatever tariffs, but the Trade Agreements Act in 1934 completely gave it to Roosevelt. And he did everything he could to reduce tariffs at the time.
And he was absolutely progressive.
Mm-hmm. All right, go ahead.
So we get out of World War II. Every modern economy in the world's been bombed to smithereens besides the United States. They meet in 1944 before the end of the war, and they have the meeting about an hour's drive from where I'm sitting, called the Bretton Woods Agreement, and that would carve out this new globalist financial rules-based order. And basically, this is the working draft for how international trade is going to be carried out under a dollar reserve system. So that gets put into place in 1944. And then we get 1948, the gap.
Now understand that the United States has become the primary manufacturer in the world at this point.
Yes.
So these agreements are good for the United States at this point. We are the ones producing the goods. We are, hate to say it, but we are the China of the time in the sense of we're the ones putting out all the goods.
But we're also paying for it because we've created things like the Marshall Plan, which is pumping billions of dollars into foreign economies so they can buy our stuff. And that is why we did not sink back into another depression. You know, you had 6 million service members coming back home without jobs. You couldn't be closing down the wartime factories. You had to shift, or at least that was the thinking there. And it was a Keynesian stimulus-driven fake recovery from the Great Depression and post-war. And that system that was put in place in 1944 is what Trump is dismantling right before our eyes. And it needs to be dismantled. It is completely usurious. It is predatory towards third world countries as we rape their resources and their people. It absolutely favors the wealthy over the poor. It guarantees high tax rates for American taxpayers for the rest of our lives. It is a debt it creates debt that can never be repaid. Created a Ponzi scheme. You know, I can pull up the debt clock. Where is it? Where's my U.S. debt clock? I lost it. Oh, well, everyone knows what it looks like. Anyways, that's the system that was put into place, and that is what Trump is trying to dismantle. Okay, and then we get to the gap.
Now, Kennedy did try to work on that, but one wonders if that's a part of what led to his assassination. But then again, I'm jumping. Go ahead. Go to GATT.
Do I need to get my fishing rod?
So GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, 1947.
Yeah, this is a big deal. It's a predecessor for NAFTA.
Which are basically doing, and this is the thing that really establishes what we have come to know as free trade.
Yeah, it's where it's got the World Bank, the IMF, and this one quote unquote rules based order, and this is creating all the rules. And what it basically is doing is giving corporations dominance over sovereign nations. they create this thing called the ISDS, which is the Investor State Dispute Settlement, where basically if a government decides to change its rules or maybe even put a tariff up to protect, its own industries, or, keep a oil driller from exploiting the resource, their environment, and all that stuff, that corporation can now sue in an international court with a 3-person tribunal for perceived potential future profits lost. And they win all the time. It allows these multinational corporations to use this new these GATT type agreements to force foreign governments to do their will so they can make more money. And yeah, if you want to talk about imperialism, that's what this is all about. It is probably one of the most vile structures ever put on this planet, and trillions of dollars have been made because of these agreements. 1962, under Kennedy, we get the Trade Expansion Act. The president receives the authority to negotiate tariff reductions up to 50%. Aimed primarily at the European Economic Community and later the European Union. This is important. It's putting the president in the position of being negotiator in chief so they can leverage tariffs and sanctions basically to mitigate other countries' behavior, both politically and economically. Any thoughts?
No, you nailed it. Go ahead. I will say that as we're watching this happen, don't forget that as we are doing one thing with tariffs, the other countries that we're trading with are imposing their own tariffs. And one of my favorite arguments is when they talk about NAFTA. And it says, well, it eliminated most tariffs between U.S., Canada, and Mexico. No, it eliminated most tariffs from us. But Canada and Mexico were happy to maintain certain tariffs. Most people.
Oh yeah, they still have them to this day. I mean, look at our American food production.
Yeah.
They can't ship.
Yeah. So this idea that nobody was charged with tariffs is, for lack of a better way of saying it, a bunch of bull. And this is where Trump gets into the reciprocal. And we forget that. When it comes to our trading partners, I mean, China, has been imposing tariffs on American goods that range anywhere from 10% to 25%, and some of them even higher. Japan, I mean, 15% tariff on imported U.S. cars. I mean, well, for a while it was 0%, but then they jacked it up to 15. You've got Japan with a 38.5% tariff on agricultural products, especially beef. You had you have India, 70% tariff on imported U.S. motorcycles and cars, 50% on agricultural products, even higher for dairy and poultry, 20% on technology and electronics. So my point is, let's not forget, that while Canada is like 200% or more on certain U.S. dairy products, for God's sake. I mean, so let's not forget that there's been tariffs against the United States while we've been, since basically GATT, have been keeping the tariffs very low.
Yeah, the other thing I wanted to point out about these trade deals that you mentioned is they all come with all kinds of carve-outs for specific industries. Mm-hmm. And that's done specifically. That's the reason the lobbyist business in D.C. is, K Street is like a multi-billion-dollar industry.
Yeah, don't forget we went into a revolutionary war over this kind of activity.
Yeah, and we're just, absolutely doing it every single day. Yeah. 63 to 67, they call this the Kennedy round, where the GATT talks are aimed at tariff reduction, primarily with Western Europe, approximately 33% reductions. Mm-hmm. You think this is a good thing?
Well, and I think even overall, even up to 35% in many cases, but go ahead.
73 to 79, they call it the Tokyo round. GATT talks aimed at non-tariff trade barriers, including non-GATT members. This is important because it really allowed for Japanese expansion in international markets. Japan became the economic powerhouse of the 80s before they imploded on their debt. A lot of that had to do with what these talks in the 70s. 74, we have the
and you got to realize too, it was largely designed to put more emphasis. Let me rephrase that. More power into the hands of what was to become known as during the 70s trilateralism. They really wanted to be an Asian, European, North American kind of economic partnership, globalist partnership. And that's really what that was all about.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. The Trilateral Commission, of course, was a Rockefeller creation. But
Jimmy Carter was a member.
Yeah. You go back to, and most of his administration was too. If you go back and look at the Axis powers, they had that same trilateral idea. Japan would have been the fascist of Asia. Germany would have had Europe, and of course the American fascists who sponsored the Nazis in the first place, who just happened to be the same people that sit on the boards of directors of most of these multinational corporations, and happened to found our intelligence agencies. That was the original, trilateral setup. And so, who actually won World War II?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. 1974, the Trade Act, Doug mentioned earlier. The president is given the authority to end tariff duties against products from developing nations. 1993, we get to NAFTA. Doug's mentioned it a bit. It is basically all the manufacturing in the Midwest gets shipped down to Mexico where they have cheaper labor. Entire towns are destroyed. One of the best things the first Trump administration was getting us out of NAFTA. Now that Mexico-America free trade agreement, I think that'll be lower on this list. We can talk about that a little bit. It wasn't quite completed.
Yeah. Well, and hang on a sec. So we have to remember, folks, economics, just basic economics, the cost of doing business. Good, bad, or in between, a business is going to operate largely on their profit margin and the cost of doing business. And one can't cut into the other. And so when the cost of doing business shifts, there's going to be a shift on how you do business to keep either that cost down or raise prices. And you don't want to raise prices because you want your market to keep going. You try to reduce the cost of doing business. So if the cost of doing business is that goods coming into the United States has no tariff, the labor is cheaper out there, the cost for maintaining a facility, for leasing the land is cheaper, and on and on and on and on, what are you going to do? And so the cost of doing business and these free trade agreements and us not utilizing tariffs has chased industry, manufacturing out of the United States. Then you have all these politicians going, oh, we got to figure out how to get, companies come back, and they're blaming the companies. Oh, see, there are these, horrible companies are doing this. Well, it came down to the cost of doing business. Give them a solution to the cost of doing business, or an incentive to come back to stateside because of the cost of doing business.
What's interesting is that Bill Clinton was the president to sign this in, and he was a pro-NAFTA guy with some side agreements, meaning carve-outs for his cronies. But he didn't get it passed with Democrat support. Clinton got it passed with Republican support.
Right.
Was NAFTA. And again, the Republican Party's modern number one lobbyist and campaign contributor is the National Chamber of Commerce. That they represent the biggest businesses. That is,
and you got to remember, this is Keynesian, though. This is pushing the consumer side.
Anyways, NAFTA was an abomination.
Absolutely.
94, we get to GATT and WTO. The new GATT agreement signed, the World Trade Organization is formed under Clinton, and they ushered China right in, despite the fact that they didn't qualify, because our multinational corporations wanted the cheap labor.
Yeah, don't forget the Clintons were also selling American secrets to China, and
Bushes did the same. Of course, to me, I can't tell much difference between the foreign policy of the Bushes and the Clintons. May as well just been one continuous 20-year reign.
And once again, it's a push towards globalistic trade, free trade, globalistic trade, and tariffs are not good for globalism.
Well, that rules-based order since the 90s has pretty much dominated global trade for the last 3 decades, and definitely has not necessarily been a good thing. You've had these international organizations, like I said, like the World Trade Organization, World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, etc. You've got these international courts. I've talked about how the Bank of International Settlements, these people are above the law. The very second presentation I ever gave, substituting for Doug's class, was talking about how the Bank of International Settlements, these people don't even have to follow laws when they're in America. They can do whatever they want. We can't spy on them. We can't subpoena their records. It is a supernatural entity we've created of this bureaucratic administrative state. And it is international in scope and has nothing to do with the Constitution of the United States. And anybody who's a proponent for it is in violation of their oath to defend the Constitution.
Now, when it comes to globalism and international trade and free trade, the best way to combat it still comes down to basic economics, basic supply and demand. It still comes down to that. So regardless of the tariffs, regardless of the foreign trade, regardless of what's going on, for example, if we start producing domestic oil, and I remember when I first started talking about that, domestically drilling for oil, and someone says, well, Doug, that's not going to do anything. We're in a global market. No, it does a lot. So, well, we're going to sell it to other buyers. We're not going to keep it here. I didn't say that. What happens is when you're domestically drilling also, you are filling the market with more supply. What happens when more supply is there? You're going to drive down prices. It's so basic economics, basic supply and demand. So even with all the tariffs against us and us having none and all that other stuff, the answer still came back to American domestic production. And this is something that our current president understands. But in order to make sure that current production happens, you got to get the federal government out of the way, less regulations, bring down the cost of doing business, and B, you have to increase the cost of doing business for the competitors, the international. That's what the tariffs are. And what that does is that encourages domestic manufacturing, because when you begin with the supply, it drives down prices, then you get the consumerism. It's not consumerism first, as Keynesians would teach.
Yeah, and so much of this whole international trade with all the carve-outs and the bureaucracy involved is incredibly inefficient. It drives up costs for everybody. It creates useless jobs of intermediaries and regulators, etc. This is the system, and it is a global system that is being unwound in real time right in front of our eyes if Trump is successful. The people that benefit from that are the resistance to everything since Trump said since 2016 on the campaign trail. That is the real battle. It's the internationalist versus the nationalist. When I say internationalist, that is globalism. This is the New World Order trying to maintain its Great Reset path, and it appears they may have met their match. What to expect from Trump's tariff wars? You're seeing a lot of first thing to understand is almost every country in the world is absolutely dependent on the United States markets without access, and the U.S. dollar. Without access to the markets, their economies tank. China is the second biggest economy in the world, and the entire nation would topple if they completely get into a trade war with the United States. Their country was built on debt. They accumulated more debt in 10 years than the United States did in 100. Their population has almost no savings. Their retirement funds are all into these real estate investments, where they build apartment complexes you invest in and nobody ever lives there. So it has no actual tangible value. They've got a huge population issue, demographic time bomb because of their one-child policy. This is a very important point for economics, and I've talked about this before, but it bears repeating. Post-World War II, just about every major country had a baby boom, massive population. Then you had a smaller population, which was Gen X. And after that, you either had an echo boom, or which we had in America, which was the millennials, or you had continued, the python's neck kept getting smaller. The only two major economies in the world that had an echo boom are India and the United States. China not only didn't have an echo boom, but they implemented a one-child policy for 15, 20 years. Problem with that is you got a smaller population, cannot support a retiring bigger population. especially when you're already overly indebted. China has got some major economic issues. They're completely dependent on the dollar. They're completely dependent on American trade. They're going to have to make compromises.
Well, we got to remember, they're communists. They believe that the way to control the economy, to control the monetary system, is through central command control. But those types of systems are dependent, they're parasitic almost, on free market systems. Without free market systems, the non-free market systems can't survive. And I think China figured this out. And so, but at the same time, they're trying to hang on to the command control, and you can't do both. Eventually, the command control will collapse.
Well, yeah, and I'd make the argument that they're no longer communist.
Well, they're kind of a pseudo-capitalistic, but
yeah,
with communist control, it doesn't work.
What it is, it's one-party control. It's an authoritarian government, and we're basically, what is it, about 1/5 of the population belongs to the CCP, and the other 80% do not, and they are an enslaved population for all intents and purposes. It is a controlled economy. What most people don't know about China is, over the last 10, 15 years, most of their provinces are very corrupt. Almost all of them ran into debt problems. A lot of their businesses ran into corruption or debt problems. So the CCP has had to nationalize not only many businesses, but also some of their provinces. This is a ball of yarn that, it's going to, when it unwinds, it's going to be very ugly. China can't replace their population because they're very xenophobic. They do not have the ability to import anyone. Of course, they have no problem with Europe and the United States doing so.
Right.
And they do push that policy. And the European Union, our other major trading partner, well, it's a mess. And it was always destined to be, because it is basically a progressive dream. They've been relying on the United States to finance their defense, so they can, all the money they save there gets them all their free healthcare, government healthcare, which doesn't work.
Plus, also now they've got a new class of people immigrating in that A, are milking the system without putting anything into it, and B, are determined to bring down the system themselves, Islam. But anyway, continue.
They impose Sharia law. We've seen that everywhere. See all these interviews. But the European Union, the problem, really one of the major problems is you cannot have an economic union without a political union. And what that does is you've got Brussels and their bureaucrats trying to impose their will on the European Union nations. And when you have, just like the United States was supposed to be a federalist country.
Yeah, what theirs is a confederacy. That's really what it is.
Yeah, well, but you got Brussels basically trying to make centralized control or decisions for a bunch of disparate, very vastly different nations.
That believe they're in a confederacy. They believe that the member states still have all the power. So you have the central power and member states battling for position here.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of sounds.
And that was really what the core of Brexit was. Mm-hmm. And of course, Brexit was a major shot across the bow of the globalists. And it really changed a lot of things. Brexit in 2015 and Trump elected in 2016, it really set the stage for what's this clash of ideologies of global trading systems. Now, if Trump is successful and everybody reciprocates and starts getting rid of these tariffs and makes everything fair, it's going to be upheaval, because it's a dramatic system change. Entire industries are going to change and be wiped out. Entire jobs are going to be gone. So there's going to be upheaval. I'm not giving it investment advice. I used to do that for a living. I no longer do. But expect volatility. The end game should be an absolutely much more prosperous America and world. Let's get all this red tape and this crap out of the way. The golden age of humanity is within reach. I can see it in my lifetime. And I think that's the end game that we're working for. But first you have to unwind, this incredible vampire squid that's had its blood funnel wrapped around the throat of humanity for more than a century, as we've just demonstrated.
It's funny because my entire life I have studied this stuff. I pay attention to this stuff, and I had pretty much decided that no one in office has more than 2 brain cells to rub together when it comes to this kind of stuff. And then along comes Donald Trump. He not only understands it as much as I do, but more so. I'm learning off of him. I'm going, whoa, hadn't thought of that. Brilliant, and so I am enjoying watching this. But I was talking about this in my radio show the other day. Well, Doug, but the markets are plunging. Of course they are. They're dependent on a global model. It's disrupting the global model. Of course, the markets are going to react negatively at first.
Yeah, people need to remember at the end of the day, stock prices are reliant on the fundamentals of the corporate's earnings.
Mm-hmm.
And if you create a system of a lot less hurdles and barriers to entry and more free markets, that can do nothing but benefit the bottom line. And eventually, a lot of these corporations are going to figure out how to take advantage of it, and the earnings will go popping right back up.
Right.
This year, 2024, this next 12 months, it's probably going to be a loss for corporate earnings as the whole system tries to resettle itself.
And it takes 6 to 12 months just for the basic foundational influences to start to take hold, and so you probably won't see the major benefits until 2026. But
as Doug mentioned earlier, we
just in time for the elections.
We didn't come into this on an even playing field. Basically, the United States was down here, and once we level that playing field, you're already seeing other international companies are building plants and manufacturing here in the States.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes a ton of sense. We do not give financial advice on this show. Please consult your own tax, financial, or legal advisors. I have gotten all out of international markets more than 3 months ago.
Old habits die hard. Go ahead.
Yeah, I've personally gotten out of all international markets. I believe that I want everything in the dollar, and I'm taking a lot less risk than I normally would. I actually, and I hate to say this, my portfolio went up in value last week because I had a lot of fixed income. I'm getting hammered today by the Treasury yields, but that should be a temporary blip. We'll see how the auction goes once we get off the show. But this is not a market show, so let's just get back to tariffs. If I were to it's something I've talked about when I was running around in libertarian circles. Now, the pure libertarian wants zero tariffs. I just don't think that's realistic. What I would like to see the United States do is enter into a compact with a bunch of other responsible nations that are willing and say, look, we're going to put a flat 10% tariff on each other. Anyone who's outside of our trade agreement doesn't want to follow our reasonable rules of free and fair trade, and that's and fair part's the important part. We get a higher tariff, and if you get a country that's acting aggressively or abusively towards people or someone we just don't want to trade with, you can keep on it. The United States will put a 30, 40, 50, 60% tariff, and that's how you use foreign policy through economic means rather than guns. And that's the way that's kind of a Monroe expansion of the Monroe Doctrine. That's what I'd like to see us end up at. Now, whether that's realistic or not, time will tell.
Well, and it's funny because get into modern politics, excuse me, is you wonder if there's anybody who could carry on after Trump. Turns out there is. J.D. Vance. He's learning from Trump. He has basically said, "Let me be your pupil," and so because the question has always been, but what about life after Trump?
Well, what's interesting about that is J.D. Vance's original mentor was Peter Thiel. And people say, Peter Thiel, he's a Silicon
And remember, originally J.D. Vance didn't like Trump also. Yeah. On top of that.
Yes, that's true. Peter Thiel, if you ever go listen to him speak, look at some of the stuff over the last 10 years, he's an absolute libertarian at heart. And he's a really, really interesting guy to listen to. Mm-hmm. I understand why people are, think Peter Thiel is one of the globalists, one of the great resetters. I would say give the guy a shot because I, had the same questions with J.D. Vance. Turned out he was people of Thiel. So I went and did the research, and I agree with an awful lot of what Peter Thiel says. And he is a libertarian.
Well, and that's the foundation J.D. Vance began with, and now he's refining it, molding it through Trump. And
I think that's why you saw a lot of Silicon Valley start to embrace Trump 2.0, where they didn't in Trump 1.0. They now understand. After 4 years of Biden really is a tough lesson as well.
Yeah,
because that was the managerial state gone wild, and it was completely incompetent, and it just was not going to work. Something had to give, and I think that's why you're seeing the approval ratings where they are. Now, if we can continue to cut government waste and fraud, and get us on a level international trade level playing field, Well, that to me, that's the recipe for a golden age of humanity. And that's what my hope is that we're going to get there. Any closing thoughts?
Just that, let's be reminded, tariffs are a tool. They can be abused. I'm not saying that all tariffs at all times are a good thing, but and in a perfect world, there'd be no tariffs on anybody, but the fact is, tariffs are a tool. They can be a negotiating tool. They can be an economic tool. They can be used as a tool in many ways, and we have to remember that. So the demonization of tariffs may have gone too far historically. Secondly, understand that things don't respond immediately. Often it takes time for whenever a tariff is used for the influences to take effect. Some of the effects will be immediate. Some of them will be further down the road. And thirdly, don't forget that there's more to the tariff percentages than what you see. We're not the only ones with the tariffs. When we say, oh, well, we're charging them a 25% tariffs. Yeah, but they've been hitting us with a 70 or whatever. Understand there are tariffs coming from the other side.
Yeah, may you live in interesting times. These are definitely those. Doug, thanks for having me on. I want to tell everybody where they can find you, please.
DouglasVGibbs.com. DouglasVGibbs.com. I put in videos out when I can. Once again, Douglas V. Gibbs is the keyword. And I got a new book out, God in the Constitution. Right now it's on Kindle. The paperback's not available. Go to Amazon if you want to look for it. God in the Constitution by Douglas V. Gibbs.
Very good. And of course, if you're watching my Rumble channel, you know where to find me there. And you can also get me at war_hamster1776. Is that it? Yeah. On Twitter. Or I guess it's now X. Doug, thanks for having me on. We will see you again soon.
It's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Cheers, everyone.